Welcome to day 31 of the Hub's 2025 federal election coverage. I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the publisher and head of the Hub as we head into this home stretch. It's great to be in conversation with two of my co-pilots as we've journeyed through the weeks of this campaign into this critical home stretch, and that's Sean Speer, editor-at-large, and Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs. Guys, I'm going to be back to you in just a second, but let me first get our audience caught up on where the leaders are and what policy developments we've seen in the last 24 hours. Mark Carney will be delivering remarks and holding a media avail in Victoria, BC at 11:15 a.m. Pacific time. Pierre Poilievre in Hamilton, Ontario. He's given a speech this morning. We caught a little bit of it before we came on air. He's now jetting off to Nova Scotia to do an announcement in former Liberal Housing Minister Sean Fraser's riding in Nova Scotia. Singh is making announcements in Edmonton and will be later meeting with the Assembly of First Nations in Winnipeg. Let's go on to policy. What have we seen in the policy world these last 24 hours? The Liberals are out with a big kind of Quebec identity package. So this is everything from a commitment to defend the supply management system as it relates to dairy in the province, expanding funding for Radio Canada, funding also for a variety of federal cultural programs that have an impact in Quebec, from Telefilm to the National Film Board and so on. So a big focus there by the Liberals, no doubt, to try to solidify some of their gains in Quebec. Singh was out with a big climate announcement, $500 million to create a youth corp to train and respond to the climate threat in Canada. Interesting idea. And Pierre Poilievre is continuing to build on his campaign platform announcement of the last 24 hours, expanding and going deeper into some of the details related to taxes, home building, and all that good stuff. Well, look, let's go to our resident pollster and expert on all things public opinion, Daryl Bricker, to catch us up on the latest Ipsos numbers. Daryl, I'm going to put those numbers up on the screen for you right now. If you could give us a rundown on what we're seeing here, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that the lead that the Liberals had a couple of weeks ago has basically dissipated. So they've gone from a 12-point lead to a 6-point lead to a 3-point lead over the course of the weekend. So I would say, based on what we're seeing here, the Conservatives have a bit of momentum going into the final stage of the campaign. Will that last? Who knows? But at this stage of the game, they've closed a significant part of the gap.
Well, let's just stay on the subject of gaps themselves, Daryl. One thing that I think we've tried to understand on behalf of our listeners and viewers is how the national numbers manifest themselves both regionally, but then also in terms of seat count. My understanding is that because of the relative inefficiency of Conservative support, which is to say its disproportionate concentration in Western Canada as opposed to the more equally distributed level of support the Liberals have across the country, it's not enough to be down by 3 points or maybe even tied for the Conservatives to feel confident going into Election Day. They probably need to be up some. Is that the right way to think about it in your mind?
Yes and no. What you should be looking at this stage of the game is not anything that precise. I think we emphasize what's going on in specific polling numbers at any moment in time. At this stage of the game, it's really about momentum.
Got it.
You know, where are the numbers moving? And trying to get some sense of why it's happening. As far as the campaign is concerned, I will say what is accurate in the conversation about seats and regional distribution is that there's really two elections going on. One of them is east of the Manitoba-Ontario border. The other one is west of the Ontario-Manitoba border. If this election was being held west of the Ontario-Manitoba border, the Conservatives would be winning comfortably and probably a majority government. But on the other side, east of the Ontario-Manitoba border, it's a much, much better picture for the Liberals. They would easily be winning a majority. So you've got these two elections that are happening. The bulk of the seats in Canada, even though the shift over time has been west, is still, pardon me, in Quebec, in Ontario, specifically in Ontario. And you win elections in Canada by uniting either Quebec with Ontario or the West with Ontario. Right now, what the Liberals have going for them is they have Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and particularly urban Ontario going for them. The Conservatives have Western Canada now moving decidedly in their direction, including in British Columbia, where we have the Conservatives with a slight lead for the first time in a long time. And they are winning in small town and rural Ontario. The question now is what happens to suburban Ontario, and that's what's more difficult to see in the polling. So every time I see numbers that come out for the 905, I'm deeply skeptical because I know the samples are quite small, but that's the key. That's the key to understanding what's going on in this election. And as the closer that the numbers get together in Ontario between the Conservatives and the Liberals overall will tell you the state of the race. If the two parties are tied in Ontario, that probably means that the Conservatives are leading in the 905, even if in the national numbers it looks really close. If the numbers are 5, 6 points apart, 7 points apart in Ontario, that probably means the Liberals are leading in the 905, which is what we have right now. So what we're seeing is that there's been a real closing of the gap everywhere. Between the Liberals and the Conservatives. We've seen the start of a closing of the gap in the province of Ontario. The question is whether or not that the Conservatives will be able to keep up that momentum, or if they'll run out of time.
Yeah. So just to recap there, Daryl, your numbers right now in terms of 905, and with the caveat, yes, the sample size is small, so the margin of error is large, but what are you seeing over the last, let's say, week to 10 days? Is there a direction towards narrowing? Is the gap persistent? What's the trend?
Well, that's the trend we're seeing. You've described it exactly. We're seeing a narrowing of the race. What's turned in from a big conservative lead into a big liberal lead is now turned into a tight race. And by the way, most races in Canada, with the exception of 2011 and 2015, have been tight races. So this is more like what we typically see. It'll come right down to the wire. And one of the things that I've really seen in our polling that we do globally, and it's something to really emphasize for our listeners. I mean, at Ipsos, we do election polls all over the world. And we don't treat them as one-off events. We treat them as kind of continuous learning opportunities. And one of the things that we've seen consistently in our polling, and this included in the United States, is there's a lot of decision-making in the last 72 hours of a campaign. And the reason for that is because partisanship is not what it once was. People don't say, I'm a conservative for life and I will be voting conservative on election day like they used to. Old election campaigns where you just identified those people and you made sure they got out to the ballot box. There wasn't a lot of persuasion activity. There was some movement, but not like we're seeing 25-point swings and going, 2 weeks ago from 12 to a 3-point lead. You don't typically see that. These days, there's a lot more persuasion activity, and particularly there's a lot more interest in persuasion in the final days of the campaign. As many as 10% of the people that we interviewed in places like France, the United States, the UK, Italy, all places where we've done election polling recently, as many as 10% actually make up their mind the day of the election or in the ballot box itself. So there's still a lot to be played for here. And I am seeing on social media people saying things like, it's decided, it's cooked. Absolutely not. Maybe in the old days it was, but not in contemporary politics. That's not the pattern of decision making that we see.
It's been a long standing axiom, Daryl, that high turnout typically favored the Liberals. Is that still the right way to think about it in the face of pretty extraordinary numbers coming out of the advanced polls? And I think some estimates that ultimate turnout could push much higher than we've seen in the past several federal and provincial election campaigns in Canada.
Hypothetically true. It was certainly the case in 2015. Certainly the case, a lower turnout favored Stephen Harper in 2011, historically low. I mean, 59%, I think was the lowest ever. Actually, there was one way, way, way long time ago, but that was lower. But, in the modern era, really, really low. And that favored the conservatives. But the point on all of this is that there are certain things that are hypothetically interesting, but difficult to prove until after the event. So the first one is that we're seeing an unprecedented level of early voting, probably favoring the Liberals. So I've seen at least some commentary on that, and that we're going to have a really high turnout election. We may. But generally speaking, what we've seen is just a greater trend towards earlier voting, but not a greater trend towards greater turnout.
Interesting.
So, and typically the studies that have been done on who the early voting favors tends to be actually the conservatives. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because there was a lot of seniors voting early. It was more convenient. They had more time on their hands. They could, choose when they decided to go to the ballot box because they weren't, committed to doing other things. So they would get their votes done a little bit earlier. But this time around, we see a change. And the change is that seniors are more interested in voting for the Liberal Party than the Conservative Party. It's actually younger people who are more interested in voting for the Conservative Party. So what does that mean relative to early turnout? Are the Liberals winning with the early turnout? There's some suggestion that they are, but that would be an atypical pattern. So all of these things that people are saying with great certainty about what all of these things predict, I don't really know. I mean, we're going to end up on election day. We'll see what the turnout is. I would be personally surprised if we're 75%, which was what it was in 1988. We'll see. I will be personally surprised if the early turnout favors the Liberals, because that's not been the pattern that we've seen in the past. But it's an interesting observation. We'll see what happens. But all of this at the moment is hypothetical and simply interesting to observe.
Yeah.
Not predictive.
Final question, Daryl. Do you feel, and I'm going to not hold you to any kind of prediction here, but do you feel that the full range of election outcomes is still on the table? In other words, there could conceivably be a conservative majority, there could conceivably be a liberal majority, there could be a conservative minority, there could be I'm just trying to understand, because the feeling of the conversation over the last, I would say, maybe the duration of this election has been that there is a large preponderance of odds that the Liberals will be forming government. And I would say in the last week or so, there is a significant part of the pundit class out there, you've heard them and seen them on Twitter, Daryl, who are confident that this is headed towards a Liberal majority.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going based on the numbers that we have today, and you're simply assessing based on the average of polls what the most likely outcome is based on the seat modeling. And by the way, there's nothing special about seat modeling, MRP. I mean, they all basically produce the same results. You would have to come to the conclusion that the Liberals are knocking on the door of a majority. But the problem that I have with that analysis is the numbers haven't stopped moving. And if you've gone from 12 to 6 to 3 in the space of 2 weeks, and you've got a week left in the campaign, this thing isn't settled. And the other thing that I know is that most of the decision making gets made in the last 72, even the last 24 hours of an election campaign. So at this point, I think it's premature to have any degree of certainty in what the outcome is going to be. If the election was held tomorrow, and by the way, that's the question it's always asked on a survey, if an election were held tomorrow, how would you vote? If that election were held tomorrow, that's what people would, that's probably what the result will be. But it will come down to turnout. It will come down to the distribution of the vote. It will come down to how people make up their minds at the end of the campaign. So, yeah, I'd say if you had to make a bet today, on whether it's going to be a Liberal government, probably that would be a reasonable assumption based on the numbers. If you had to make a bet on it being a Liberal majority, that would be a less reasonable assumption based on the numbers. If you were going to bet on a Conservative minority, that would be a very optimistic take based on the current numbers. But on any of those things, I might bet $1, but I wouldn't bet 2.
Okay.
just because of the preponderance of late movement in election campaigns. I mean, Doug Ford was going to win a really big majority on election day in the last provincial election in Ontario, and all the pollsters had that. I think we even had a more than others did for the Conservative Party. But the way the distribution of the seats took place, it was a slightly more majority, but the NDP found a way to hang on,
Yeah.
even though they lost a significant portion of the votes. So, you know, stay tuned. There's more polling that's going to be coming out. We'll see what the preponderance of the trends are, and we'll have a better sense by the weekend as to what's going to be happening. But anybody who's saying that this thing is over, not based on the evidence I'm looking at.
Excellent, Daryl. So fascinating. Terrific to have you break this all down and lend us your 30 odd years of experience studying elections and voter behavior and patterns closely. So let's get you in a couple more times before we go to E-Day and then on election night. We look forward to spending a bit of time with you as we have the polls roll in and we can see where this wonderful prediction machine that we've been talking about actually ends up landing.
Great. Thanks very much, guys.
Take care, Daryl.
Fascinating stuff, Sean. Interesting idea that, it could be more fluid. My big takeaway from that interview is Ipsos's experience internationally, that there is more undecided voters on election day and in the ballot box than there was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we should be thinking about that.
Yeah, I just don't know what to make of what that would mean and how that may manifest itself, particularly since ostensibly a lot of those voters registered are people who aren't necessarily making their decision based on competing analysis of the party platforms. It's based a bit on intuition or a read of the different leaders. And so given the high favorabilities of Mark Carney over the course of this campaign that have really been sustained, one wonders if that might favor him. But as Daryl says, I guess we'll ultimately find out on Monday night.
We sure will. Well, look, on the back half of the show, a real pleasure to welcome on the program Peter Menzies. He's one of our stars of a surging hub podcast called The Full Press, where every 2 weeks we dig into the latest developments in Canadian media. He's a former vice chair of the CRTC and a seasoned newspaper man, an ink-stained wretch of the highest order. Peter, great to have you on the program.
Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure to see you guys.
Want to talk subsidies with you, Peter. Sean and I would confess that the last 48 hours or so have been a little bit grim in the Hub's kind of quixotic battle to call the media out on subsidies. And the reason for that, Peter, isn't simply that, as expected, Mark Carney has reaffirmed large-scale funding increases for the CBC, has basically been quiet on subsidies, but that quiet, I think, speaks volumes that the entire subsidy regime that funds now half of all journalists' salaries in Canada will remain in place in a Carney government. I think what kind of knocked Sean and I for a loop was the Conservative platform doubling funding for the Local Journalism Initiative. This is a program established by the Trudeau government to fund local papers, but it's also found its way into larger outfits, subsidizing journalists on the basis of their coverage of issues that the government kind of selects, gently or not. Peter, what do you make of it all? And what do you make of the Conservatives embracing a key plank of the Trudeau government's subsidy regime?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, what I make of it is that the era of a free, independent, trusted media in Canada is finished. It's done. That's the end of it. There won't be any going back. And we won't read much about it. Maybe we will in the Hub. Maybe we will in Blacklock's Reporter, Western Standard. A handful of holdouts if they can hold out as the years goes by, because I expect those subsidies will just get bigger. My main take on it is that basically the shakedown of the political parties by what you'd want to call, I guess, big media in that sense, has succeeded. They finally got to the point where it's politically unaffordable to not give them money, right? It's almost like it's I was recalling the Niagara Now incident
Yes.
from last summer, right? Where,
Yes. A
in what
recipient,
Katie,
incidentally, of the local journalism initiative, precisely
yep,
the program that
absolutely.
that the Conservatives have committed to Dublin.
Yeah, and pretty much losing its mind over Polyev saying that he was going to cancel these subsidies. It was Katie Telford, the chief of staff for Justin Trudeau, tweeted that it was the longest editorial ever written. But at the end of the day, Niagara Now wins, right? That they kind of like bullied the conservatives. The media have successfully bullied the conservatives into giving them money too. So now there's nobody who won't give them money. So in future elections, it'll just be,
How
it won't
much?
be whether or not they get money.
Yeah.
It'll be how much. It'll be an auction.
Yeah, I think that's right, Roger and Peter. Uh, there are opportunities when these policies start to take shape in a short window to contest them, but at a certain point they become part of the furniture, and everyone accepts them as the new baseline. And as Peter says, you stop revisiting old policies and you start talking about how to expand them. And I think that's precisely right. What do you think, though? Let's go a bit deeper, Daryl, because Peter, because as you say, not only did Polyev signal then his intention to, if not repeal, then certainly reform these programs, as early as days leading up to this election campaign, in a podcast interview with Juno News, he promised that his platform would set out the details on a conservative reform to the panoply of media subsidies. This is a clear broken promise from the conservative leader. Talk a bit more about what you think explains it.
I mean, what I think explains it is political pressure, right? They're obviously under pressure. They need as few fights as possible down the stretch if they're to have any chance at all here. So that's my assumption in terms of that. That a lot of those, especially a lot of those smaller town media, they're really tied into this. They're very, very
Very
afraid of
dependent.
the
Yeah.
conservatives, cutting that off in that sense. So I think the conservatives probably got a lot of pressure on that file, or felt a lot of pressure in terms of that to try to keep. I guess I'd call it boomer media um, on side in that sense, because I mean, if you want to reach boomers, that's how you do it. Is
Yeah.
like you go to the um, legacy media, because
Yeah.
the younger people don't vote for that. And this is sort of the one thing about this election. It could be the last stand of the boomers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yes.
um, they'll be around for a bit yet, but their numbers are in decline.
Yeah. Peter, I want to go back to what you said just about how this represents a watershed moment in the industry that your career, was reflected in over your decades of engagement with the media and press as an editor, publisher, and writer. When you put together, let's say, the most likely outcome of this election, a Mark Carney win, and you have a CBC potentially doubled if he truly wants to bring it up to a per capita funding model equivalent to, let's say, European public broadcasters, and then add over on top of that these massive public subsidy sectors to private broadcasters and digital news outlets. What the heck does that do, Peter, to the whole kind of info ecosystem that all of us exist in? What kind of dystopian future are we on
it's
the verge of?
it's very risky in my view. The big problem is that what they're funding is production, not consumption. I was hopeful that the conservatives would come out with something
Yeah.
about funding consumption, with tax
Yes.
breaks on subscriptions and that sort of stuff. As long as you're funding production, it gets like the CRTC sort of regime, right? You spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars a year funding Canadian content. Nobody watches it, right?
Yes.
But you judge your success on how much you spend in terms of productivity. So now there's going to be less pressure. There will still be some pressure, of course, but less pressure on media to be consumed as long as they're producing. But the really scary part is that if public trust declines with that group, and a lot of you guys have done polling, that shows that the public is deeply suspicious of this. There aren't going to be any headlines about the death of trusted media because they all know that the subsidies don't look good on them. But as that mistrust grows, the less people will leave them and they'll go elsewhere onto the internet. And I hope that they find trustworthy sources, but they may not.
Yeah.
And that's where you risk a real kind of breakdown in the trust within institutions and that sort of stuff, because there are trustworthy people like yourselves, but you're not covering school board and that's, local school boards and that sort of stuff. But if as I say, as people's trust declines, then they just go elsewhere, and elsewhere might be kind of nasty.
You mentioned, Peter, the potential that the Conservatives were ultimately motivated here by being responsive to local outlets, particularly in conservative-held ridings where local MPs, might feel pressure to defend and sustain the subsidies. But pulling it up a bit, like to what extent do you think Post Media and the Toronto Star, two companies that own the most outlets across the country, have in fact either intentionally or inadvertently caused themselves to become effectively too big to fail? And that their advocacy efforts, particularly Post Media targeting the Conservatives, is to say, if you don't sustain these subsidies, you are going to be responsible for the dissolution of outlets all across the country because of the holdings of Post Media. In other words, like Peter, one can't help but wonder that Post Media has become almost like a nuclear weapon, such that they've put politicians in this excruciating decision about whether to support subsidies or risk its collapse. And is the takeaway that the government should be seriously looking through the Competition Bureau to breaking up Post Media, so it's not indeed too big to fail?
Well, I mean, there's sort of two things there. The Competition Bureau, I don't know about. I mean, one of the things with the way Post Media is structured these days is that it's funny to talk about too big to fail, because a great many of the titles that they have right now are actually already dead.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
they're staggering around like zombies. Right?
Yes.
There are formerly weekly papers out there that are online only right now that have a minimal number of stories posted to them in a week, maybe a month. They're generally Canadian press stories. So they really aren't functioning as they carry some local advertising, just enough to get in the way of somebody coming into the market and serving it genuinely and covering the school board and sponsoring the minor hockey and doing the sort of things that Jeff Elgie does a pretty good job of at Village Media. So I think they've probably convinced people that they're too big to fail. I know publishers at Torstar doesn't really have that much anymore, but non-Post Media newspapers who really want Post Media to fail because they're cluttering up the ecosystem. And I know of other people who can't wait for some of the Post Media titles to fail so they can run in, buy the title, because those titles still have some pretty good brand values. There's Star Phoenix, the Leader Post, et cetera, the Chronicle Herald, and start something new again.
Yeah.
But what you're doing is subsidizing this sort of death march, because that's how it's going to end, right? Yes. Unless it ends with just more and more subsidies so that the hedge fund keeps getting fed.
Yeah.
I think we have a title for this. I think we have a title for this segment: Post Media's ongoing death march.
I think the analogy
I
like
it's been predicted for years, but like I said, it's what we've missed is that a lot of it already is dead.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, check out their financial statements, because as a part of their financial disclosure each year, they have to write in their subsidies, just like, Alliance Atlantis and all those, Canadian film production companies had to do exactly the same because investors need to know. It was $11.5 million last year that they collected in just the payroll subsidy, not the new Google money. $11.5 million. This is real money. Final question for you, Peter. What the heck is your advice to outlets like The Hub? I mean, we are one of literally a handful now of hundreds and hundreds of titles in this country who are not accepting any subsidies. And we've done that for reasons of, frankly, independence and trying to be different from the rest of the media. But Peter, we are like, how do we compete? How do we compete when our competitors are accessing these subsidies? They're probably going to get bigger. When the CBC could be expanding and competing against us on every single vertical that we operate, whether it's, digital ads, podcast ads, newsletters. I don't know, Peter, like, what the heck do we do?
I don't know, because it's kind of unimaginable. We're actually in this position where if you want to get into the news business in Canada, you have to take the government's money.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a pretty golden set of handcuffs, right? That they're dangling in front of everybody. And it's one thing to sort of dangle the gold in front of you. It's the other thing to have a noose sort of threatening behind you, right? If you don't take the money,
Yeah.
you're not going to live, right? I mean, the hope and the prayer, I guess, and it may be more in hope than expectation, is selling subscriptions. Yeah. I know, and it depends on your size and your value, and appealing to that. I mean, you're going to come out of this election, like Darrell was just saying, likely, looks like the Liberals are going to win it, that sort of stuff. But as I wrote for you guys at the beginning of this, at the end of this election, there are going to be a lot of people who are very, very disappointed in the media. And they are going to be looking elsewhere. So from a business point of view, I would try to exploit that disappointment as far as I can and sell a few subscriptions.
Yeah. Wise words.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Can I just say something, Richard, before we wrap up? For those listeners who may not stay for the live chat, I mean, I think particularly those conservatives who tune in every day, they need to understand that this is a case of the Conservative Party, of Pierre Poilievre, an ostensible conservative, someone who's characterized himself over the years as a quote unquote libertarian, essentially deciding that we need to have an ongoing government takeover of private news media in Canada. There's nothing conservative about this. This is an acquiescence on the part of Poilievre and the Conservatives to big government entering into the news media, a critical part of our civic life, of our civic infrastructure. You might like the tax cuts you saw. You might like some of the deregulation things that he's announced over the course of this campaign. But this is a massive concession on the part of the Conservative Party to the Trudeau government's agenda, an agenda that they've resisted and opposed for the past decade. And it represents a kind of fundamental failure of conservative politics. If conservative parties are going to champion the government takeover of the private news media, what's the point of conservative parties? Like, what do they exist for? What do they stand for? What's its purpose in our political life? I just think it's a massive failure that transcends this election campaign. It speaks to something much deeper about the purpose and role of the Conservative Party in our politics.
Yeah, well said, Sean. Well, you are a dear friend, Peter. You're a fellow janissary in this quixotic battle against state control of our media through massive subsidization. And we're so fortunate to have you on our terrific media podcast, The Full Press, and writing regularly on these and other issues related to the media in the Hub. So listeners, viewers, do check out Peter's work for us at www.thehub.ca. Thanks, Peter. We'll keep up the good fight with your help.
Thanks. Keep the faith, brothers.
Yeah. Amen. I love Peter. Again, storied career in the press. This guy has done it all, from newspapers to vice chair of the CRTC. He knows like the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I think for someone like him, Sean, to come out and basically say that this election is the moment where an independent and free press in Canada died is is noteworthy, and I don't think it's hyperbole. I think, unfortunately, something has really broken here. And for me, it really broke over the last, 36 hours with this conservative platform, enhancing liberal policy vis-a-vis subsidies to the press, because it suggests, Sean, doesn't it, that this is now a bipartisan consensus in Canada, large-scale subsidies to the press.
Precisely. And a lot of conservatives, I think, need to look themselves in the mirror. They've sustained a campaign for 2 years in favor of defunding the CBC. But Rudyard, what they need to understand is the difference between the CBC at this point and most private outlets is only a matter of degree, right? The CBC's public-private funding represents something like a 70-30 ratio. Its public appropriation is roughly 70%. It derives 30% of its revenue from other sources. We characterize that as a public broadcaster. Postmedia and some of these other media outlets, increasingly, as you say, on a per journalist basis, will be receiving something like 50 cents on every dollar. So are they public broadcasters? Are they public outlets? Like, at what point do we cross the threshold that, for all intents and purposes, our entire media ecosystem comprises of mini CBCs? And if so, how do conservatives look themselves in the mirror and, on one hand, say we need to get out of the business of having a public broadcaster, and on the other hand, talk about essentially expanding the public broadcaster model to every private outlet across the country? There's a kind of incoherence on the part of Poilievre and the conservatives here that at the root can't be explained by ideas. It has to be explained by politics, which is to say that the party has succumbed to pressure, as Peter says, from local interests and from Postmedia to essentially adopt Justin Trudeau's media policy. That means there is no voice, there is no party today standing up for an independent private news media in our country. We have, as you say, a bipartisan consensus that runs from Pierre Poilievre to Justin Trudeau. And what does that mean for the future of media? I think Peter put it well. It means that it is over.
Yeah. And what's so creepy is that so much of it is covert. The payroll subsidies, you can't find out as a voter, as a viewer, as a listener, as a reader, whether the organization you're watching, reading, listening to is subsidized, because that information was never required. That disclosure was never part of that government policy. And during this election, as the Hub has reported on extensively, millions and millions of dollars of this Google C18 money is flowing into these news outlets, and they are not disclosing it. It will eventually be disclosed, conveniently a month after the election. But right now, most major media brands that you are reading and consuming have received this Google money and are not telling you about it. So there's something really creepy, Sean, about this whole situation. It's like, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Therefore, there's no problem, everybody. The media doesn't report on this. They write favorable stories about the subsidies. They greenwash them. It's just, I don't know, Sean. This is yucky stuff that we're in the middle of.
And I would go further. Not only, as you say, are they essentially concealing the extent to which they are now essentially mini CBCs. They are not private outlets. They have more in similarity to the CBC than they do, say, the Hub. They also employ all of these columnists, particularly the Postmedia chain, who make their living railing against corporate welfare and government largesse and big government and all the rest. Like, look in the mirror, buddy. You are as on the take as anyone working in the electrical vehicle industry or in supply managed industries or any other parts of our economy that are dependent on a combination of government protection and government subsidy to sustain their employment. So every columnist at the Financial Post, for instance, is, for all intents and purposes, has a fake job, a job that's sustained by you and me, or in this particular case, through deficit financing. And so every time that they write a column arguing in favor of getting rid of supply management or whatever, they should have to disclose that there is essentially, at least conceptually, no difference between them and the supply managed dairy farmer in Quebec, for whom they have so much disdain. They are both ultimately working in occupations that derive from ongoing government support.
Oh, hypocrisy. It's such a wonderful thing, isn't it? as you can tell, we get a little hot under the collar on this topic because it's something we feel passionately about. That's why we're proud to be part of the Hub, because this is a value-driven, principle-animated organization that does not receive any government subsidies. Any that we receive, we will donate to worthy causes, charitable causes across Canada. Well, if you're listening now or watching on demand and through our podcast feed, thank you for being part of this day 31 of our continuing coverage of the 2025 election. I'm going to say goodbye to you and join our online audience who's tuned in as of 10 a.m. each Monday to Friday on YouTube to catch the live show. They get the little perk, the plus of hanging around with Sean and me to do some questions after we give out this bye-bye. So here it is. Bye-bye, everybody.